In 1938, C.G. Jung gave a famous interview, which came to be titled Diagnosing the Dictators. In this piece, he briefly explores the psychology of the mass political movements of his day, namely what was going on in Germany, Italy, and Russia, as well as the psychopathology of their dictatorial figureheads. Today's presentation will bring Jung's technical analysis up to date, in line with modern psychodynamics, as represented by Psycho-Systems analysis, and apply it to the modern world around us. There is a lot of confusion in the culture, and indeed in many internet spheres, as to the etiology and pathogenesis of what drives the spread of ideology, and of what motivates certain individuals to seek controlling power over other people. The answer to this question centers around the intentionality and manner of expression of corrupted instinct. Today you will hear an applied exegesis of Steve Richards' Freud, Adler, Jung formula, which explores and explains the trajectory of certain instincts through three distinct stages of expression, with each represented by those three great analysts. Freud seeks Adler. Adler conceals Freud. Jung inflates and falls victim to both. This formula contains the key to revealing the intention of libido. You will also hear an extensive analysis of the dynamics of homeostatic regulation within the psyche of some of the leaders of the world today, representing a standalone episode in our recent series on the Trickster function. This video is composed of a series of narrations from the writings of Steve Richards, a depth psychologist with over 40 years of clinical experience, and the co-founder, together with his wife Pauline, of the Institute for Psycho-Systems Analysis. What follows now is a series of dialectics between Steve Richards and one of our professional depth psychology students on this topic. The student asks, does Carl Jung's diagnosis of the 1930s dictators apply in any way to the political leaders of the world today? Steve replies, yes. In his 1938 interview, Jung took a clinician's perspective, so we will do the same now. To understand psychodynamically, we need to apply the Freud-Adler-Jung formula. Freud seeks Adler. Adler conceals Freud. Jung inflates and falls victim to both. In this, Freud represents instinct, Adler the will to power, and Jung the transpersonal. The formula runs like this. Freud, instinct, seeks Adler, power. Adler conceals Freud, as power attempts to hide its true instinctive base. Power then elevates itself into Jung, the transpersonal, and necessarily inflates, as in wokeism and virtue signalling, ultimately falling victim to both corrupted instinct and power. This is true, clinically, of the ordinary individual, and equally so at the very highest levels of politics. Instinct seeks gratification in the world, hence it must be delivered through political power. An unsophisticated dictatorship will reveal itself openly, as it did in the 1930s and 1940s. A more sophisticated form will not. Rather, it will use incremental step changes in leading a population into a state of compliance by direct or implied threats to their fundamental instincts of status, security, and survival. Basic social instincts operate algorithmically. Once the suggestion is made and accepted that social compliance is the only appropriate level of response to political change, a population will collectively default into that compliance. In other words, the population regulates itself, like a herd, with individual freedom subsumed to that of the politician's diktat. The aim is that compliance, however uncomfortable, will always appear to be a better option than any resistance. Political persuasion that manipulates the instinctive self-regulation of a population is the most economical and effective means of control. In the overt dictatorship, this is exaggerated, giving a population the motive and the eventual will to resist. In more covert dictatorships, democracy is utilized to gain rapport, and then incrementally eroded, so that the population are directed by the process of pacing and leading into surrendering their freedom. In both cases, the same motivational dynamics are at work in the politicians. The psychological nudge units, or behavioral insight teams employed by Western democratic governments, are used to direct their citizens into accepting political policies. Insofar as the techniques employed manipulate instinct, they are successful. So, the fundamental instinct for gratification drives politicians to seek power as the means for possessing and controlling resources. Once they have power, they strive to keep it by elevation of their power drive into a transpersonal ideology that the population believe they must serve, thereby meeting the dictator's narcissistic demand for supply. Thus, in terms of psychopathic pathology, does Freud, instinct, seek Adler, power, and then inflate itself, Jung. The inflation of politicians is of course well known, and attested to throughout human history. Behind the facade of their office, the degraded politicians' sexual and other instincts play out. This is particularly true in dictatorships of any kind. Once a political power drive organizes itself into an ideology, you can be certain that corruption and perverted instinct will be present, and then ultimately destroy it. This happened tragically in the 1940s. The loss of life then was catastrophic. Today we see a very wide range of dictators. Some are overt, as in the 1930s and 1940s. Others are concealed by the appearance of democracy. They imagine, as all dictators have before them, that they are in control of their own will to power. However, they lack a conscious relationship to the trickster as the ultimate regulator, not only of an individual, but also of a group, howsoever large it may be. Freud seeks Adler. Adler conceals Freud. Jung inflates and falls victim to both. To identify the covert dictators of today, remember that what is within, so too is without. The true character of an individual, including dictatorial politicians, will reveal itself, because their libido, their life force, has intentionality. And in politicians, that is always their own self-gratification. By their libido shall ye know them. And yet regulated at every turn by the compensating power of the trickster. The student replies, in Discover Your Personal Myth, Ultimate Handbook, when discussing the phenomenon of Hitler's rise in the 1930s and his subsequent fall in the 1940s, you described the trickster as a self-regulating factor within politics. Would you say that this collective psychodynamic is still at work now? Steve replies, yes, and it's really important to understand just what the trickster is and how it operates to regulate entire populations. To do this, you must move away from seeing it as only something psychological. What we see of the trickster culturally, or through spontaneous internal images, such as dreams, fantasies, or even the use of psychedelics, is only a representation in experienceable form of something deeper and more fundamental than psychology as such. The first mistake to avoid is becoming transfixed by the figure of the trickster, thereby misunderstanding its context, which is the ground against which it is set. The second mistake is to see that ground as being cultural. That's only its local context, just as an individual's psychology is just the personal one. The true collective and universal context is biological. Just as the metabolic need for nutrition surfaces into consciousness as the image of a specific kind of food, so too do instinctive and ultimately genomic needs surface into consciousness as images. The trickster, as one such image, is the representation of a homeostatic process that serves biology at the level of the genome, both individually and collectively. Individuals are under Darwinian lifespan development pressure to optimize their genomic potential. To do this, they must be balanced, both internally and in their psychosocial relationships. This balance is not a fixed state or position. It's necessarily dynamic, which means that adaptation, Freud's reality principle, requires constant adjustment to avoid a suboptimal, or even worse, a maladaptation. At this individual level, the trickster operates to collide the polarities found in a typical neurosis, thereby enforcing a new adaptation. It also acts to correct for inflation by leading the individual into psychosocial situations that overlay regulation onto the inflated individual. The repeated collective experience of this over countless generations has led to the image of the trickster being recorded in culture and appearing from within the person as a corresponding a priori consciousness or anticipation of the imago of the trickster. The trickster itself, however, is not its image or representation. It is a function that organizes the limits of adaptability in a person and in a culture. This function is genomic in origin and expresses itself as a field phenomenon that links individuals through higher resolutions of homeostatic regulation. These operate collectively from the level of any two-person relationship, progressively upwards, to eventually include the species level of interaction and adaptation. As the individual's level of social interaction progresses, they will encounter the effects of the power principle exerted on them through politics. The trickster operates here in service of Darwinian forces to regulate the play of adaptation collectively. Politicians, however, are individuals, and as such are regulated by the trickster function on both levels, that is, individually and collectively. So long as their behaviour serves the collective level of adaptation, the trickster will quote-unquote allow them their play. However, the more a politician subsumes others' needs to their own, the more they constellate a correction in the form of the trickster, which may lead them to their ultimate downfall. The unconscious algorithm behind this is genomic. Hence, when the trickster steps in, it can seem to be supernatural, or otherwise as an intelligent or organised turn of fate. We can see this at work now. On the surface, it is not like the 1940s, or even the Cold War that followed. But that is to be distracted by superficialities. We have dictators of all kinds, overt and covert. And we have individuals who act as tricksters within politics. The important distinction, and the only healthy outcome for such a compensating politician, is not to identify with the role of the trickster. Back in the 1980s, it was possible to predict the fall of the Soviet Union, including what would happen with Soviet President Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, who succeeded him. Gorbachev was functioning within a specific economic and political ecology, but also a collective psychological one that meant that he was not actually in power so much as being directed by collective psychological forces of tidal intensity. Yeltsin appeared as if a trickster, then sometimes even as a hero, but he was human, and the same forces that orchestrated Gorbachev and even Ronald Reagan in the US also directed him. It was similarly possible to predict what had happened in China, including around the Tiananmen Square massacre. Then, when the British handed Hong Kong back to China, and what has subsequently happened in and with China since. These predictions would not be through any special precognitive ability, but instead by applying fundamental Jungian observations on collective psychology, and in particular of the trickster, to the global political situation. To uncover the work of the trickster in contemporary political events, and how all political actors are being regulated by it as a function, all it is necessary to do is to approach things from a combined genomic, Freudian, Adlerian, and Jungian perspective. The student then asks, does the trickster manifest or operate differently for different political ideologies? Steve replies, it does not, as what appear to be opposites politically are only so on the surface. The fundamental driving force is the same deep structure Adlerian will to power, which itself sits upon a Freudian instinctive base. Ideologies are Jungian-style abstract inflations that induce people to identify with them, but that only make sense in relation to power, Adler, and instinct, Freud. The student further asks, do Jung's Anima and Animus have a role to play in the motivations of politicians? Steve replies, Jung's constructs of Anima and Animus are specific resolutions of a wider relating function, which serves genomic adaptation. Many politicians cathect their biological and social relating into politics. In other words, their individual mating and relating instinct becomes subsumed into the drive for political power. In some cases, this is partial. In others, complete. Corrupted sexuality through the abuse of power has long been associated with politics. Politicians motivated by the highest of humanistic values will be using Jung's positive anima animus, just as those who are not could be associated with Jung's negative anima animus. The role of the trickster as part of the relating function includes regulation of the anima and animus if they manifest insufficiently or too one-sidedly. This appears in the lives of individuals and within groups, as well as in politics. To understand relating from a Jungian perspective, as applied in the real world, it is necessary to avoid abstracting any theoretical construct out from its wider ecology. The so-called shadow, the anima, and the animus are all themselves regulated by the trickster, and each are part of the relating function of both an individual and wider humanity. We really hope that you have enjoyed today's video and found it useful. If you did, perhaps consider checking out other videos on our Jung To Live By channel. Thanks everyone, take care, and speak soon.